It was the last week of February 1949 when Sergeant Raymond Doyle loaded his Jeep Willys and set out from his small farm near Lake Arbour. Snow fell in soft curtains across the Saskatchewan prairie, the kind that erases tire tracks within minutes. He told his sister he'd be back by nightfall, just a short drive to deliver spare engine parts. By morning, the Jeep was gone. For months, search parties combed the shoreline, their ropes snagging on roots and sunken branches. Locals said the veteran must have taken his own life. Others whispered of debts and government work he couldn't speak about. Then for decades, nothing until a drought drained the lake and a license plate rose from the mud. Beneath it lay a submerged vehicle sealed tight as a tomb and a story the province had quietly buried. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The storm that swept across Saskatchewan that February evening was the kind locals called a white silence. Snow fell without sound, blanketing the grid roads and erasing the boundary between field and sky. At 4 p.m., Sergeant Raymond Doyle backed his Jeep Willys out of the yard, the engine grumbling against the cold. He'd returned from the war 5 years earlier and still carried himself like a man measuring distance in miles and orders. The Jeep, an old Army surplus vehicle he'd rebuilt with his own hands, rattled as he shifted gears and waved once toward the house. His sister Irene watched from the porch, her breath rising in pale clouds. He had promised to be back by nightfall with a crate of spark plugs from town. By 8 p.m., the wind rose to a howl. Neighbors saw nothing but the faint sweep of headlights heading north toward Lake Arbour. When the storm cleared by dawn, all that remained was a white plain pocked by drifts and fences half buried in snow. The tire tracks that had left the Doyle property vanished halfway down Range Road 2. No skid marks, no sign of struggle. Only the hush of wind sweeping across the open lake. Constable Marlon Breck, stationed at the Arbour detachment, received the missing report just before noon. He logged the time 11:45 a.m. and wrote in the margin, veteran known local vehicle, Jeep Willys olive drab license 7H214. The first responders found the cabin locked, the coffee pot still half full, a trail of snow melting across the floor from Irene's boots. On the kitchen table lay an unfolded topographic map worn at the creases, Lake Arbour circled in red pencil. They began their search that afternoon. 10 men, rope lines tied around their waists, combed the frozen shoreline with poles and lanterns. They found one set of boot impressions leading from the embankment down to the ice prints, deep and steady until they ended in nothing. No return trail. When the sun fell, Breck ordered the men back, promising to continue in daylight. But by morning, wind had covered the lake again. Irene arrived at the detachment with a thermos and refused to leave. He knew the weather, she told Breck. He wouldn't drive out on soft ice. Breck didn't answer. The Jeep had been serviced that week. Gas can half-full tires new. He recorded every detail, even the scent of motor oil that lingered in Doyle's garage. On a peg near the door hung the canvas map case edges, cracked faint grease along the seam where a thumb had pressed repeatedly. When the press ran the story, it filled half a column, veteran missing and blizzard search continues. No mention of debts, of the unpaid repairs at Carlson's Auto, or the rumor that Doyle had been storing old munitions for a salvage firm. Breck heard whispers in the cafe that Doyle had seen something during the war he shouldn't have, that the Jeep was a cover for deliveries still unlogged. Yet records showed he'd been employed at the grain co-op since returning steady work. Quiet man. By the third day, snow drifts reached shoulder height. The search parties dwindled. Breck's men tested the ice near the western cove with iron rods, noting cracks that widened under weight. They dragged the shallow bay, but brought up nothing except reeds and rusted wire. The official report would later state, presumed accident, possibly through ice under severe conditions. But there was no open water that week. At Irene's request, Breck visited the farm one last time. The kitchen smelled of cold wood smoke. She'd packed her brother's uniform into a chest by the window. He was meant to meet someone, she said quietly. He circled that lake 2 nights ago, said it was for old business. Breck took the map, folded it carefully, and slid it into his coat pocket. Outside, the road shimmered under thin sunlight, the kind that made every field look the same. A crow perched on the fence black against the glare. Breck wrote one final note in his field book before heading back. Last known location 2 miles south of Arbour, 4 p.m. No further trace. By spring, the snow melted into gray slush and the lake returned to glass. Irene stayed through the thaw, waiting for some piece of her brother to surface. None did. The jeep, the man, the road itself, all swallowed. On quiet nights, she could still hear the faint creak of tires across frozen ground, the echo of an engine that should have stopped hours before. At the RCMP post, Breck sealed the file, initialed the cover, and placed it on the bottom shelf of the cabinet. The label read, "Missing presumed drowned." When he turned off the light, the wind outside rattled the glass, and for a moment he thought he heard the sound of a motor beneath the ice. The snow sealed every track before dawn. By the first week of March, the case file was thin. A few witness notes, weather logs, and photographs of an empty road. Constable Marlene Breck stared at the paperwork under the dim station lamp, the ink bleeding slightly where the nib had caught moisture. The lake was still frozen solid, and the temperature hovered near 10 below. It was Irene Doyle who arrived again before sunrise, carrying her brother's military dog tags on a string. She placed them on the desk and said, "He wouldn't have gone down without leaving something behind." Breck nodded more out of habit than belief. He organized another search party, 10 men, 2 sled teams, and a borrowed outboard winch from a nearby farm. They moved along the southern edge of Lake Arbour, marking each grid section with small red flags. The ice groaned under their boots, echoing like distant thunder. Beneath the surface, bubbles drifted in slow, trapped columns. By noon, they'd opened a dozen small holes through the crust and probed with steel rods. Nothing but silt and reeds. A farmer named Hal Meren claimed he'd seen headlights near the western cove the night Doyle disappeared. Breck rode out with him, the 2 men squinting against glare ice until they reached the spot. Meren pointed to a bend where the ice had refrozen unevenly. "Right there," he said. Headlights swung out toward the willows, then gone. Breck noted the coordinates in his log book, 10:03 p.m. that night, according to Meren's pocket watch. The time matched the hour Irene said her brother would have been returning. They drilled again at that location. The auger came up coated with fine black grit. "Motor oil," one volunteer muttered. Breck sniffed the residue, faintly chemical, heavier than lake sediment. He stored a small vial for testing, though the detachment lacked proper equipment. The report would later describe it as hydrocarbon trace unidentified origin. A second test yielded a partial wrench corroded but marked with engraved initials RD. Breck rinsed it in meltwater and placed it in a cloth pouch. Back in town, rumors multiplied faster than evidence. Some said Doyle had suffered shell shock that he'd driven onto the ice to end it all. Others whispered about stolen salvage contracts, that after the war, surplus weapons and parts had gone missing from storage depots in Regina and Moose Jaw. Doyle, being a mechanic, might have stumbled onto something he shouldn't. The veteran community was tight, their silence unyielding. Breck knew better than to pry openly. Each night Irene waited in her kitchen, the radio tuned low, the map spread beneath the lamplight. She traced the red circle around the lake with her fingertip, the pencil mark, fading under her touch. Breck visited once more, bringing the recovered wrench in an envelope. She held it like an heirloom, wiping away rust until the letters appeared clear, RD. He never marked tools unless he planned to keep them, she said. That means he was working. What kind of work? Breck asked. Private, she answered. For the firm that bought up surplus steel from the bases. He wrote the name down, North Prairie Logging and Supply. The company was new post-war handling transport contracts up toward Prince Albert. When he called their office, the clerk said Doyle had been subcontracted for one delivery in late February. No details provided. Records got burned in the stove, the man added, laughing nervously. Breck made a note, possible connection to industrial scrap shipment. That night, he sat alone at the detachment. The wind had dropped, but the walls creaked with temperature change. He unrolled the map found on Doyle's table. Near the red circle marking Lake Arbour, a thin line in pencil ran west toward the unmarked cove, the same place Meren had described. At its end, a small arrow pointed to the waterline. Beneath it, faint letters spelled Camp 9. Breck had never heard of such a place. He checked the provincial survey archives and found a reference to Arbour Supply Camp 9, decommissioned 1945. No record of who had operated it, just an inventory of fuel drums, vehicles, and one note disposed 1248. The handwriting matched a military clerk's notation. Breck folded the paper slowly, realizing the missing man had likely been tracing something long before he vanished. By early April, the ice began to thaw. The second drag attempt failed, cables snapped, and a volunteer fell waist-deep through a soft patch. The search was suspended until the next freeze. Irene refused to give up. She brought sandwiches to the men, collected their findings, and kept every fragment of information in a biscuit tin. Inside it, she placed the wrench, the vial of oil, and a photograph of Raymond standing beside the Jeep. The license plate shone white against the mud. On his final visit that spring, Breck found Irene asleep at the table, the map draped across her arms. He lifted it gently and saw new pencil marks, her own tracing paths, beyond the lake toward the timber roads to the north. She was still searching, not for a body, but for reason. Breck folded the map again, his thumb leaving a faint grease mark on the corner, and said nothing. He sealed the wrench and the oil vial into an envelope marked "Unconfirmed Evidence." When he locked the station that night, the snow outside had turned to sleet. He could hear water running beneath the ice, a deep, slow movement, as if the lake was swallowing air. In the dim light, his own reflection shimmered in the window beside the filing cabinet. The label on the folder read, "Doyle Raymond, missing, presumed drowned." A line on the map leads to an unmarked cove. The drought of 1959 came like an unspoken debt from heaven, weeks without rain, fields cracking, the lake receding, to reveal a bottom people hadn't seen in living memory. Boys fished where water once reached their waists, and the air smelled of iron and clay. It was late August when 16-year-old Thomas Rare, poking through the mud near the western cove, stumbled upon something square and rusted. A license plate twisted, its paint barely visible, but still legible, 7H214. The town sheriff didn't remember the number, but old records did. Within a day, the RCMP detachment at Arbour received a call from Regina headquarters, matches the Doyle case. Missing since 1949. The paper file was still in storage edges, yellowed ribbon faded. Constable Marlon Breck had retired 8 years earlier, but his notes filled the margins. Small corrections, arrows, linking dates, a single underlined word, Camp 9. The province sent 2 officers to reopen the file. Breck, now gray and stooped, was invited back as consultant. He arrived carrying his old field book, its spine cracked, the ink smudged by time. "I knew it would come up someday," he said, staring across the shrinking lake. The shoreline was now a wasteland of silt and exposed roots. On clear afternoons, the outline of old ice tracks appeared faintly beneath the mud-frozen ruts, preserved like scars. The divers they brought in weren't professionals. Local men with borrowed air tanks and an oil drum for compressor air. Housing. They waded out following the coordinates Breck had marked years ago. At a depth of 12 feet, they struck metal curved, smooth and solid. The first thought was wreckage from old construction barges, but the measurements matched a Jeep Willys. When the mud cleared, the front grille emerged, still bearing the faint star of military surplus paint. The news spread by evening. Crowds gathered at the shore, pointing to the spot where bubbles rose. "It's him," someone whispered. The veteran. Irene Doyle was there too. Thinner now, her hair white as the sand. She stood beside the tape line, watching as the retrieval cables tightened. Her eyes did not blink when the crane lifted the Jeep's hood above the waterline, its windshield shattered, headlights clouded over like cataracts. The investigation began again, though it felt more like an autopsy of history. The local paper headline read, "Missing Jeep found after 10 years, fate of driver unknown." The journalists asked Irene for comment, but she refused. That night, she took the original map from its tin box and laid it on her table. The red pencil circle had bled through the paper over the years, forming a faint halo around Lake Arbour. She placed the rusted license plate beside it and whispered, "He was right there all along." At the detachment, the new investigators compiled a preliminary report. They photographed the Jeep from every angle, scraping samples from its frame. Forensics sent word a week later. Corrosion levels suggested submersion beginning within weeks of Doyle's disappearance. Proof the vehicle had been underwater since 1949. The doors were sealed tight. No visible damage to the undercarriage. But one odd note stood out. The gas tank contained traces of diesel, not gasoline. A deliberate replacement, someone said. Breck studied the findings with a steady calm. He wasn't driving to town, he murmured. He was hauling something heavier. The senior officer shrugged. Post-war supply vehicles often carried mixed fuel. But Breck remembered the wrench, the map, the talk of a private job. He asked to inspect the shoreline near the retrieval site once more. There, half buried in sand, he found a rusted chain looped around a cedar stump, cut clean as if by hacksaw. He pocketed a link for testing, though the metal had already turned black with age. That evening, Irene visited him at his rented room above the general store. She carried the map again, this time folded in newspaper. "They'll call it an accident," she said, "like they did before." Breck looked at her hands, ink-stained, trembling slightly. "Maybe," he said, "but accidents don't circle the same lake twice." They walked down to the cove together before dusk. The water had receded enough that the Jeep's tires sat half-exposed, rimmed with barnacles. In the distance, dragonflies skimmed the surface where reeds used to grow. Irene knelt and touched the frame. The steel was rough edges, curled inward from pressure. He knew this lake, she whispered. He'd never drive in blind. Forensic divers continued for 2 days, documenting each detail. They recovered small fragments, a cigarette lighter, a cracked compass, and one leather glove pressed beneath the dashboard. No body. Breck stood with his hands in his coat pockets as the crane operator cursed the weight. When the Jeep finally rested on the truck bed, sunlight glinted through the shattered glass, scattering reflections across the mud. That night in the temporary command tent, one officer remarked that it looked more like a sealed vault than a vehicle. If he was alone, the man said, "Why lock the doors?" Breck said nothing. He was watching the condensation forming on the tent wall, small beads of water running like ink lines. In his mind, he could still see the map's faint trail ending here, and wondered if the red pencil had been drawn for himself or for whoever might come after. As they loaded the Jeep for transport, Irene stayed until the last rope was coiled. Breck offered her a lift back to town. She refused. "I'll walk," she said. "I want to remember the sound of it leaving." The truck rumbled off, tail lights flickering against the dark. In the rearview mirror, the lake shimmered like a half-closed eye. 10 years of silence had broken open, and yet nothing felt finished. Divers locate a glimmer of metal beneath the silt. When the recovery team drained the remaining water from the Jeep Willys, the stench of iron and algae filled the air. It had been sealed under the silt so long that its interior looked preserved, not destroyed, only frozen in time. Investigators pried open the driver's side door and found a leather ledger folded inside a waterproof pouch wedged beneath the seat springs. The first page bore the stamp of the Canadian Army Ordnance Corps. Inside were tidy columns of numbers and short signatures, the handwriting crisp as though entered by someone meticulous and trained. At the bottom of the final page, one name repeated 3 times, B. Halverson. The RCMP lab in Regina handled the contents carefully. The leather had hardened, but the inner pages were dry. Among them was a folded photograph, a group of 6 men in front of a fuel truck, all in partial uniform. Doyle stood second from the left, his expression unreadable. Behind them, a signboard read Camp 9. The place that had been nothing but a rumor on an old map was now anchored to evidence. Back at Lake Arbour, the forensic divers completed their work. The Jeep's tires were intact, steering wheel locked in a hard left turn. The key still sat in the ignition. Breck, standing at the rope line, squinted at the windshield. A small circular indentation marked the driver's side metal frame, not from ice pressure, but from impact. Ballistics testing confirmed it later, a wartime .45 caliber round. Whoever fired it had done so from close range, maybe from the shoreline. The conclusion was quietly logged as the impact consistent with small arms discharge. The public release omitted that detail entirely. Irene arrived when the Jeep was unloaded at the depot garage. She stood close to the open door, staring at the items laid out on the table, the leather ledger, a rusted compass, a wristwatch frozen at 10:03 p.m. "That's the time Maren saw the headlights," Breck said softly. Irene nodded once, her face pale. She reached for the watch, but the officer stopped her. "Evidence, ma'am." Her hand withdrew. The discovery triggered a brief media surge. Journalists printed stories about wartime ghosts and buried secrets beneath Saskatchewan lakes. But the officials in Regina issued a measured statement. No foul play indicated pending further analysis. The case once again began to settle towards silence. Breck, now working as a private investigator for the province, kept digging. He traced the name Halverson to a retired army captain living near Prince Albert. The man answered the door wearing slippers and a wool vest, his right hand trembling from age. "Ray Doyle," he repeated, staring past Breck's shoulder. He was supposed to deliver a report, not disappear with it. He wouldn't elaborate, only muttering that Doyle found things better left underwater. When asked about Camp 9, Halverson's jaw tightened. "That place was decommissioned," he said. "Orders from Ottawa." Breck noted that response in his field book, evasive rehearsed. Before leaving, he asked if Halverson remembered the Jeep. The old man gave a thin smile. "Every one of us had one back then. The army sold them by the dozen. They kept running long after the truth stopped." Meanwhile, lab technicians confirmed that the Jeep's frame bore traces of military-grade sealant, not standard for civilian vehicles. Whoever last handled it had intended it to stay watertight. The engine compartment was packed with oiled rags, the vents sealed with resin. A deliberate sinking, but why seal something and still leave the ignition key in place? Breck pictured Doyle methodical and trained, realizing too late he'd been made part of a disposal plan. He called Irene that night from the depot office. The line crackled under static. "They found something else," he said. "A crate small wedged behind the passenger seat. Nothing inside but dust and one stamped tag, Project Cinder." She exhaled sharply. "He wrote that word once," she said, "in the margin of a letter home." She described it late 1948. He'd complained of hauling leftovers from the military yard to private sites. The word Cinder had appeared once then, scratched out. By dawn, Breck was driving back to the lake, the map in his pocket. Under a magnifier, he noticed that the red circle wasn't alone. A faint dotted line ran south toward another mark, barely visible beneath grease stains, an arrow pointing inland. When he overlaid it on new aerial photos, it matched a stretch of unregistered timber road ending near a collapsed logging site. Camp 9 perhaps not so abandoned after all. He brought the map to the district lab for scanning. As it warmed under the light, the paper released a faint odor of smoke and oil, the kind found in old machinery sheds. One technician remarked that the carbon residue along its folds matched motor soot, not fireplace ash. "He carried this in the Jeep," Breck said quietly. The lab sealed it in a clear plastic sleeve, labeling it Evidence Item 7. When he returned the next day, Irene was waiting by the lake. "They'll say it's finished," she told him, "but it never is. My brother didn't drive into that water. He was driven there." Breck didn't reply. The sun was lowering over the cove, painting the thawed mud red. He watched the ripples move out from the spot where the Jeep had rested for 10 years. In that moment, he thought of the sealed ledger, the neat handwriting, the names that weren't soldiers, and the bullet that had stopped time at 10:03 p.m. The story was beginning to breathe again. The ledger lists names that aren't soldiers. The leather ledger sat under a glass case in Regina headquarters, its ink line steady despite a decade underwater. Each column marked with initials, transaction codes, and payment figures. Most were ordinary supply reimbursements, vehicle shipments, equipment maintenance, until the bottom of one page listed 3 entries marked Private Load Transfer Arbour Sector. The signature beside them was unmistakable: B. Halverson. Constable Marlon Breck had seen Halverson's signature before on the decommission reports for Camp 9. That connection, buried in routine paperwork, was the thread he'd been waiting for. He requested a formal interview with the retired captain. The man lived quietly on the outskirts of Prince Albert, his bungalow wrapped in birch trees. Breck arrived in the drizzle of early May, carrying both the ledger photocopy and a service photo from 1944. Halverson opened the door himself, pale and frail, the war still visible in the way he stood. When Breck mentioned Doyle's name, something in his expression faltered. "I thought that business was finished," he said. His hands trembled as he poured tea. He wasn't supposed to be there that night. "What was he delivering?" Breck asked. Halvorsen looked away. "Salvage, metal scrap, leftovers from the armory project. Nothing worth killing over." Breck placed the ledger on the table, then explained why his Jeep was sealed tight, fuel switched to diesel, and a bullet lodged in the frame. For a long moment, only the rain spoke. Finally, Halverson muttered, "There was an order. Disposal of materials not meant for inventory. Doyle volunteered, said he'd do the haul himself. But when he saw what was inside those crates, he changed his mind. Said it wasn't scrap, said it was dangerous. What was in them?" Halverson's eyes flickered toward the window. "You don't want to know. They called it Project Cinder." He refused to sign a statement. Breck left with only his notes written in shorthand: possible munitions disposal, Doyle interference, industrial cover. The pieces didn't yet fit, but they pointed towards something larger than a missing veteran, a logistical ghost threading through post-war contracts. That same week, the lab returned due results. A trace of oil residue recovered from the Jeep's undercarriage matched industrial diesel used by heavy machinery, not civilian vehicles. The chemical composition was identical to fuel samples from a lumber transport yard 50 miles north, the one owned by North Prairie Logging and Supply. Breck drove there alone, the road long and empty. The property looked abandoned, sagging warehouses, oil drums stacked like tombstones. Inside one, he found invoices crumbling to dust, a ledger similar in format to Doyle's, though incomplete. The carbon paper imprints showed faint names and shipment codes, the word Cinder stamped beside several. That night, he sent the documents to the regional office. Hours later, he received an abrupt phone call: return all materials to storage. Investigation exceeds provincial jurisdiction. It wasn't an order. It was a warning. He spent the next day at Irene's farmhouse. She listened without reaction as he explained what he'd found. "They'll bury it," she said. "Same way they buried him." "He's already found," Breck replied quietly. "Now we need to find why." Irene fetched the original map from the chest where she kept her brother's uniform. She spread it over the table once again. "He drew this himself," she said. "The circles, they're not just for the lake." He was tracing where the trucks went. Breck studied the map under lamplight. The pencil lines intersected with the timber roads, leading north roads that no longer appeared on any provincial survey. When he aligned them with aerial photos, one point matched exactly with a clearing listed in wartime archives as Camp 9. That night, in the detachment office, Breck submitted a final note before transferring the file to Ottawa. Evidence indicates unauthorized transport of war material through Lake Arbour region under private contract, 1949. Last witness Sergeant Doyle, possibly eliminated for breach of secrecy. It was never acknowledged. The next morning, the file's reference number vanished from the registry index. Weeks later, Irene received a small envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a strip of photographic -6 frames. She held it to the window and saw the silhouette of a lakeshore drums lined in the snow, men in uniform rolling them toward the ice. On the edge of one frame, a Jeep Willys stood with headlights burning and a man half-turned toward the camera. She brought it to Breck in silence. He held the film under a desk lamp. In the 5th frame, Doyle's figure was visible near the waterline, his face obscured by glare. Behind him, a man in officer's coat, possibly Halverson, raised a clipboard. The discovery gave the case new life, but also new caution. The province classified the negatives as historical material restricted. Breck kept a copy of the scan in his drawer, nonetheless. He noticed something the archivists missed: Each drum bore a painted mark, faint but visible under magnification. A small, black cinder shape like a burned-out circle. Later that night, he reopened the map again, tracing each circle in line until one caught his eye. Near the top margin, half cut off by the fold, Doyle had written a single word in block letters: cinder. The meaning was still buried, but Breck knew where to dig next. A corner of the map shows a red X over Camp 9. Spring thaw came late that year, flooding the back roads and softening the timber trails that led into the northern reach of Lake Arbour. Constable Marlene Breck drove slowly, the RCMP truck slipping in mud tires, cutting deep tracks through decades of pine needles. The air smelled of rot and engine oil, the scent of something waking beneath old soil. He followed the faded coordinates on Doyle's map until the trees opened to a clearing littered with rusted fuel drums. The place had once been a supply depot, now only the skeleton of a camp, rotted bunk posts, the twisted frame of a radio mast, charred piles of lumber. A hand-painted sign leaned in the dirt, barely legible: Camp 9. He walked the perimeter, marking each depression in the ground where barracks once stood. Behind the collapsed mess hall, the earth had sunk inward, forming a shallow pit clogged with leaves. When the wind shifted, he smelled something faintly sweet: decomposition, long delayed by frost. He called the regional lab team before sundown. By morning, the site was taped off and humming with generators. Investigators uncovered metal fragments, first ration tins, bullet casings, melted glass, then beneath a layer of compacted soil, a scrap of fabric. A week later, skeletal remains emerged. The skull was fractured, the jaw intact. Dental comparison confirmed the impossible Raymond Doyle. Breck stood silently as the forensic technician sealed the evidence bags. Could have been buried by the thaw, one officer suggested. Breck didn't respond. The bones were found nearly half a mile inland, nowhere near the jeep. Someone had moved him. The coroner's report listed head trauma consistent with blunt impact and closed with a single line: body transported post-mortem, probable cause accidental burial following ice collapse. But Breck had seen the bullet mark on the jeep's frame. The phrasing was a lie. He knew the report had been edited before release. He spent that evening in the detachment office, the windows fogged with rain. He reviewed Doyle's ledger again, those same 3 private load transfers. One destination read C9 disposal site. He matched it to Camp 9's coordinates and found they aligned perfectly. The deliveries had ended the same week Doyle disappeared. When Irene was notified, she came without a word. At the morgue, she placed her brother's dog tags on the counter beside the sealed remains. "He came home," she whispered, though her face betrayed no peace. She asked to see his belongings. The technician handed over a cloth pouch labeled "Recovered Personal Effects." Inside were a broken pen, a coin, and the same compass found in the jeep, its glass cracked but needles still trembling north. Later that week, the official statement went to press: veteran's death confirmed after 10 years. No criminal suspicion. It satisfied the province, not Irene. She appeared at Breck's doorstep that night with the folded map in her hands. "They gave this back," she said. A tag dangled from it. "Item 7 released from evidence custody." She spread it on the table, her voice flat. "They're closing it for good." Breck traced the familiar red lines again. The ink had faded except for one circle drawn heavy around the lake's north shore. "You see this?" he asked. "That's a second X." He marked it for a reason. She nodded. "He said there were 2 shipments. If they found him at the first site, maybe the second still holds the truth." They drove out before dawn. The road curved through miles of swamp, every culvert echoing the hum of the truck. At the lake's northern rim, the ground dipped toward a thicket of birch. The trees were young, too young for their size. Something had disturbed the soil not long before. They dug by hand at first, spades cutting into mud laced with rust flakes. After an hour, Irene's shovel struck metal. A corroded crate surfaced, stamped faintly with the letters ND49. Inside, waterlogged paper peeled away to reveal stenciled numbers and faded ink inventory logs. Lists of weights, signatures of unnamed drivers. One entry bore Doyle's initials beside a date, Feb. 27, 1949. Underneath the papers, a twisted metal tag clung to the crate wall. The word was barely visible, etched by hand cinder. They sealed the box and drove it straight to the RCMP field office. The supervisor glanced at the find, then ordered it transferred to environmental records for safekeeping. Breck understood the tone, another quiet burial. He went home that night and sat with the compass Doyle had carried. It still pointed north, even as rain drummed the roof. The radio hummed low in the background, reporting another landslide near an abandoned camp north of Arbour. He turned the dial off. The case was officially over. But the questions remained. The following morning, he filed his last report. Confirmed identification of Sergeant Raymond Doyle through dental comparison. Evidence suggests transport to Camp 9 prior to death. Classified material removed from site before recovery. He never saw the file again. Within a month, he was reassigned. On her final visit, Irene left the map on his desk. "Keep it," she said. "You're the only one who still looks." He didn't argue. After she left, he placed it in a manila envelope marked Archive Personal Reference. When the lights went out that evening, the shape of Lake Arbour still glowed faintly through the thin paper, a second X glinting near the shore as though waiting to surface again. Her finger stops on a second X near Arbour's north shore. The official files, closed in 1960, stamped, "Resolved no criminal cause." But for Irene Doyle, the word resolved meant nothing. The map remained pinned above her kitchen table, the compass beside it. She spent the next decade writing letters to ministries, veterans' offices, even the archives in Ottawa, seeking answers about Project Cinder. Most went unanswered. Those that did came back with the same line: records unavailable under Section 4 National Materials Disposal Act. By 1970, she was 53, and weary but still persistent. That year, a young journalist named Evan Keats arrived from Winnipeg to cover a story about lake pollution in northern Saskatchewan. When someone told him about a wartime dump site near Arbour, he knocked on her door. Irene hesitated at first, then led him inside. Her kitchen was more archive than home folders. Envelopes, the original wrench, and the folded map sealed in wax paper. "This is everything they left me," she said, spreading the contents across the table. Keats flipped through the pages carefully. "You kept it all." "They kept the rest," she replied. He recognized the term cinder immediately. Environmental reports had whispered of it, a post-war disposal project involving chemical munitions. "You understand what this could mean," he said quietly. "If they dumped ordnance in the lake." "They already did," Irene interrupted. "I just need someone who'll make them admit it." Together, they traced the faint second X at the lake's north shore, the one Breck had once noted. It led them to a patch of overgrowth where the shoreline bent inward. When they cleared the brush, they found the foundation of a small shed, its roof long caved in. The smell of fuel still lingered in the soil. Inside lay shattered glass vials and wooden slats stenciled, "Property of Defense Procurement." Keats photographed everything: the debris, the rusted hinges, the old government stamp. He mailed the negatives to his editor in Winnipeg. A week later, he received a call. "We can't run this without confirmation." Breck, now long retired and living quietly near Moose Jaw, answered Keats's letter 2 months later. His handwriting was shaky but clear. "If you found the northern cove, you're close. But be careful." Records were removed for a reason. He enclosed a copy of one page from his 1959 field notebook, a coordinate list, and a notation reading, "C. Merrin West Cove sighting." The list ended with a question mark beside Camp 9 transfer zone. Encouraged, Keats and Irene applied for a federal access request. The reply came 3 months later. All files relating to Cinder 1946 to 1950 remained sealed under national security classification. They pressed on anyway. Locals still remembered the night Doyle vanished, especially the truck drivers who once worked for North Prairie Logging and Supply. One of them, an old man named Lem Curry, recalled seeing a convoy of 2 that February night engines idling by the ice. "We weren't supposed to watch," he told Keats, voice cracking. "There was a crate fell off the sled. They pushed it under the ice with poles. Said it'd keep till morning." Irene showed him the photograph of the lake taken from Doyle's negatives. Curry squinted at it. "That's it," he said. "That's the same shoreline. We dumped more than scrap that night." Keats recorded everything on a small tape deck. The interviews built a pattern not of a single accident, but of a coordinated disposal. He began drafting an article titled "The Veteran Who Knew Too Much." His editor delayed publication, citing verification issues. Within weeks, the negatives from the shed disappeared from the newspaper's archive envelope. When Keats called the local records office to check Breck's original notes, the clerk replied, "Nothing under that name here anymore." He drove to the detachment in person, but the file shelves had been replaced by new steel cabinets. The index card reading Doyle Raymond was gone. Irene didn't seem surprised. "They've been erasing him since the day he drove out," she said. Still, she refused to stop. They returned to the shoreline a final time before autumn froze the mud. In the dim evening light, the collapsed shed looked almost ceremonial, beams crossing like bones. Keats shone his flashlight inside and caught the edge of something metallic buried under the dirt floor, fragments of ammunition crates, their slats charred at the edges. He scraped one clean and found stamped numbers 49-12 CNDR and a faint whiff of fuel. He stored a small splinter in a glass vial for testing. Days later, he delivered it to a provincial lab under a false label wood sample for pollutant analysis. The technician called back within a week. "Whatever this is," she said, "it's contaminated. We found residue consistent with propellant compounds." She paused. "You want me to destroy the sample?" Keats told her to keep it frozen. When he informed Irene, she simply said, "Now it begins." They didn't know yet that a month later, the lab freezer would be broken into, the sample gone. The report shredded. The technician would be transferred south without explanation. That winter, a small feature ran on page 8 of the Prairie Record. Family of missing veterans seeks federal inquiry. It quoted Irene briefly, her words reduced to a single line, "The lake remembers more than they think." 2 days later, she received an unmarked envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a grainy photograph, a zoomed-in copy of the map she once owned, the flash overexposed across the top margin. Beneath the familiar 2 red X's, a third mark had appeared, faint, half-hidden under tape. She showed it to Keats, her voice low. He marked 3 sites, not 2. A photo shows a third mark, faint, hidden under tape. Winter 1917 brought hard ice back to Lake Arbour, locking the water into silence once more. The province filed its last environmental summary for the year and moved on, but Irene Doyle and Evan Keats did not. The photograph with the third mark became their compass, a faint symbol almost erased by time. When they layered it over Doyle's map, the mark aligned perfectly with an abandoned limestone quarry 15 miles northeast of the lake property once leased to the Caldwell Construction Company. A wartime contractor dissolved in 1950. They borrowed Breck's old coordinate notes and drove out on a gray morning. The quarry was half collapsed, its basin filled with ice and dead reeds. Around the perimeter, heaps of rusting machinery slept under snow. Near the lowest pit, they found an old warning sign shot through with bullet holes. "Danger, unstable material." Keats took photographs while Irene walked the frozen edge, her boots creaking on the crust. "He marked this," she said quietly. "He knew what was buried here." They returned a week later with a provincial inspector Keats had persuaded under the pretext of an environmental survey. The inspector, a man named Jory Beckett, agreed to a limited examination. He lowered a probe through the ice and called up readings that made his face pale. "There's metal down there," he said. "A lot of it's sealed containers. Some are giving off trace emissions." Within days, the RCMP's Environmental Division reopened the file, citing possible hazardous waste. Keats and Irene were barred from the site, but Beckett slipped him a copy of the initial report before it vanished into bureaucracy. Preliminary analysis indicates presence of leaded fuel residue and unidentified ordnance material. Recommend immediate containment. Keats understood what that meant. Explosives, munitions, or chemical remnants, the same type of cargo Doyle's ledger had hinted at. The findings connected every location marked on the map. Project Cinder hadn't been rumor, it had been an operation. He drafted another article this time, less accusation than chronology. A chain of evidence from the submerged jeep to the recovered crates and the quarry readings. When his editor refused again, citing national security implications, Keats mailed copies to 3 other papers. None responded. That spring, federal authorities took over the quarry. Workers in white suits installed fences and tarps. Reporters were told it was a fuel remediation project. Irene watched from the road, her hands gripping the car door. "They're cleaning their past," she said. Late one evening, Beckett visited Keats in secret. He looked exhausted, his hands shaking from caffeine and fear. "I'm being transferred," he said. "But before I go..." He slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a grainy photograph of a steel drum half exposed in mud. Its paint was blistered, but a faint stencil was visible. R. Doyle, 1949. Keats stared. "He signed them." "Not exactly," Beckett replied. "His name was printed, as if he was the inspector of record. Someone used his authorization stamp." That night, Keats and Irene met again, spreading the new photograph beside the old map. Under the lamplight, Doyle's ghost seemed to move through each mark. First the lake, then Camp 9, now the quarry. Irene's eyes glistened as she whispered, "He didn't die for nothing. He tried to stop this." Keats promised to find proof that would make publication unavoidable. He filed an information request under the Freedom of Information Act, newly passed that year. The response came 6 months later, a single sheet, heavily redacted. Only one line remained readable. Cinder operations concluded April 1950 under directive from Provincial Defense Liaison Office. He published the sentence anyway in an op-ed titled "The Veteran They Forgot." It caused ripples, small, temporary, but real. Radio hosts debated it, veterans wrote letters, and within months, the provincial government announced a review of wartime disposal practices. When investigators returned to the quarry that autumn, they drained part of the basin and unearthed several sealed drum, their lids fused by corrosion. Inside were sludged remnants of munitions compounds and shards of machinery. One drum bore Doyle's service number, the digits faint but legible under flashlight. The evidence was undeniable. But before Keats could film his follow-up, the site was sealed again under a new federal classification. Access revoked. All documentation collected for containment review. The headlines disappeared. That winter, Irene received her final letter from Breck. It was written in a shaky hand and postmarked from a nursing home in Moose Jaw. "I told them once it wasn't an accident," he wrote. "Now they'll call it cleanup. Keep the map safe. Truth waits longer than we do." Irene framed the map in her hallway, the red pencil lines now ghostly beneath glass. She taped the photograph of the drum beside it. Keats, meanwhile, stored his remaining negatives in a locked drawer at his flat. He began writing a manuscript, part memoir, part reconstruction. He titled the first chapter, "The Man Beneath the Lake." The story, he told himself, wasn't over. One drum bears Doyle's service number stenciled faintly. By 1972, the official story of Lake Arbour was quiet again. The government's remediation project had come and gone. Fences left to rust in the wind. The papers that once reported on the Doyle mystery now filled their pages with oil strikes and trade disputes. But beneath the silence, small ripples persisted. A librarian from Regina sent Keats a sealed envelope with no return address. Inside was a faded microfilm catalog marked Department of Defense Disposal Operations, Prairie Region, 1948 to 1950. Most entries were routine, but one, barely visible at the bottom of the list, read, "Project Cinder, Command Provincial." Keats unspooled the microfilm at the university archives. Grainy frames flickered through the reader inventory site. Photographs, and in one shot, a typewritten note attached to a requisition form. Subject: final shipment, Arbour Lake per Sergeant Doyle, report to Command Provincial. He printed the frame, the edges blurring with static. Beneath the line, someone had scrawled in pencil, "To be buried forever." He took the copy straight to Irene. She stared at the paper, her face caught between triumph and sorrow. "He wrote that," she said. "That's his phrasing. He used it when something was finished, to be buried forever." He must have known they'd silence him. But the proof was incomplete. Keats needed confirmation from the government side. He contacted the Department of Defense Liaison, a woman named Margaret Shaw, who agreed to meet off record in a diner outside Saskatchewan. She arrived, nervous, scanning the parking lot before sitting down. "I read your articles," she said. They weren't wrong. Project Cinder wasn't just fuel disposal, it was experimental. Some of the material came from overseas stockpiles, nerve agents, prototype munitions. They needed somewhere remote. Doyle was auditing shipments and found the paper trail didn't match the loads. He wrote to Command Provincial, then he vanished. "Why bury it for 30 years?" Keats asked. "Because it worked," she replied quietly. No one ever found the full ledger. He placed the photocopy of Doyle's note on the table. Shaw's eyes widened slightly. "You shouldn't have that," she whispered. "If this surfaces, they'll shut you down." When Keats returned home that night, his apartment door was ajar. The desk drawers were open, papers scattered. The map and negatives were gone. He found his tape recorder overturned on the floor, the cassette missing. He didn't call police. He already knew what the report would say. No sign of forced entry. Nothing taken of value. The next morning, Irene arrived to find him sitting in the dim light, staring at the empty space where the map had hung. "They took it," he said simply. "Every copy." She went pale. "Not every copy," she whispered. From her purse, she withdrew a folded carbon duplicate, faint, but still legible. "I made this years ago before the ink faded. My brother's mark doesn't vanish that easily." Together, they studied the fragile sheet. On the back, pressed faintly through from pencil pressure, were numerical scribbles, 491812C. Keats recognized the pattern military coordinate shorthand. The same format appeared on the requisition forms for Project Cinder. They mailed a copy to Shaw, who never replied. A month later, news broke that she had resigned for health reasons. Keats started keeping duplicates in multiple envelopes mailed to trusted friends in different cities. The paranoia settled into routine. Irene, ever composed, continued her letters to government offices, now quoting specific codes. She never received acknowledgement again. One evening that fall, a diver named Alistair Nunn, who had worked on the 1959 retrieval, appeared at Keats's door. He looked older, gaunt, his voice hoarse from years of cold diving. "You should know," he said, "they found something else down there after the jeep. Told us not to log it." "What was it?" Keats asked. "A steel locker, small, sealed tight. They hauled it out, then told us to forget it." "What was inside?" Nunn hesitated. "An envelope. Waterproof. Said Command Provincial on the front. Same phrase your man used." Keats felt a chill run through him. "Where is it now?" "Gone. Handed over on site." Never saw it again. He noted every detail in his field book handwriting, trembling from adrenaline. That night he dreamed of the locker rising from black water mud cascading off its lid, a single envelope glowing inside. Weeks later, a retired technician from the Regina Depot contacted him anonymously, saying he had something from the Arbour haul. They met behind an old warehouse where the man handed over a brown envelope wrapped in wax paper. Inside lay 3 water-stained sheets, carbon copies of correspondence stamped 1949. Each addressed to Command Provincial. The signature block read Sergeant R. Doyle. The pages were fragmented but legible enough to confirm what Keats had suspected. Doyle had warned of improper disposal of munitions and unlogged materials in civilian waterways and urged a halt to Project Cinder pending audit. The third page ended with the same line as the microfilm, "to be buried forever." He turned them over to a trusted archivist, but the next morning the archivist called, voice trembling. "They're gone," she said. "All 3 pages. And someone asked who delivered them." Keats pressed his hand to his forehead, realizing how close they were and how tightly guarded the past remained. He drove to Irene's farm that night. Her lights were off, curtains drawn. When she opened the door, she looked older than ever, but her eyes were fierce. "They can take their papers," she said, "but they can't drain a lake." On her table, the compass still pointed north. Outside, the autumn wind moved across the fields like the rustle of deep water. Envelope mentions Project Cinder to be buried forever. It was the spring of 1992 when the name Project Cinder surfaced again. This time not from rumor or whispers, but from a government declassification list buried deep in a federal bulletin. A junior archivist in Ottawa had mistakenly unsealed the file during a routine transfer. It contained nothing but cover sheets, a brief mission summary, and one chilling paragraph. Project Cinder, authorized for final disposal of chemical and ordnance materials. Prairie Region, 1948-1950. Oversight assigned to Command Provincial under joint military-industrial supervision. Civilian assets repurposed for transport efficiency. Operation concluded March 1950. No mention of Doyle, no jeep, no deaths. Only an appended note stamped decades later. Records incomplete due to flood damage. But the damage, as Keats soon realized, was deliberate. The release rekindled old questions, and within weeks, a local TV station aired a retrospective titled The Vanishing Sergeant. Viewers called in with memories old photographs, and one former clerk claiming to have typed the very requisition forms Doyle had signed. He was the only one who asked where the shipments were going, the woman said. Everyone else just signed and kept quiet. The story reached Regina and beyond. Within a month, the Provincial Assembly demanded an inquiry into post-war dumping. For the first time in 40 years, official letters arrived at the Doyle farm. The RCMP confirmed that recovered remains had been re-examined and matched to Doyle's dental record, beyond doubt. Foul play not proven, the statement read, but inconsistencies noted in documentation. Irene, frail now and living in a care home, listened to the broadcast from her hospital bed. He never needed proof, she told the nurse. He left it under their feet. The inquiry hearings opened that summer in a modest courtroom in Regina. Keats, older, gray-templed, sat among the reporters. On the first day, an expert witness presented photographs of the Lake Arbour recovery, the jeep suspended in mud, the bullet indentation, the wristwatch frozen at 10:03 p.m. The evidence was known, the witness said. It was simply inconvenient. Then came the documents, photocopies of Doyle's ledger, the fuel analyses and the recovered envelope stamped Command Provincial. Though the originals were missing, the committee accepted the secondary scans as authentic. Their cumulative weight pointed to the same conclusion the veteran had stumbled upon, an unauthorized disposal network, one mixing government contracts with private industrial waste. Why hide it for half a century? One member asked. A retired procurement officer answered without hesitation. Because no one wanted to admit the army used civilian lakes. The water table the community's too close. If he had spoken, it would have ruined careers. The phrase Project Cinder appeared 16 times in the final transcripts, each instance followed by black redaction bars. The last witness, a forensic archivist, confirmed that an envelope matching Doyle's handwriting had been logged in 1959 at the Regina Depot before being removed by unknown party internal. When the inquiry ended that fall, the verdict read like a compromise: no criminal culpability, but acknowledgement of grave procedural failures. The press called it closure, but Keats knew better. He watched as the chairman folded the documents into a binder, stamped it public copy, and sent it to archives. He also saw what wasn't there, the missing pages, the microfilm, the true orders. Still, one artifact changed everything: the map. It was entered as Exhibit 14, preserved under glass. Doyle's red pencil lines glowing faintly under the courtroom lights. The jurors leaned in as the prosecutor traced them: Lake Arbour, Camp 9, the quarry, each X marking the buried past. The audience sat silent. Even the judge's gavel seemed reluctant to break the spell. After the hearings adjourned, Keats lingered near the evidence table. An aide gathering exhibits whispered, "You know they'll lock it away again once this ends." "I know," he said, "but for now it's in daylight." The next morning, the inquiry's audio recordings were released to the press. Journalists transcribed Doyle's own words from the envelope letter, projected on screens across the country. Improper disposal of munitions in civilian waterways. Request halt pending audit. It ran for one full day before a government spokesperson called it historical context, not admission. When Keats visited Irene in the hospital, he brought her a copy of the transcript. She read the paragraph slowly, lips trembling. "He got his voice back," she murmured. He left the room quietly, unsure if victory or mourning had filled the silence behind him. That winter, he received a cassette from an anonymous sender, postmarked from Ottawa. The label read simply, "Cinder Inquiry, Day 4, Taped 2. Halfway through the recording, the audio cut mid-sentence. The speaker, an unnamed clerk, had been describing how records were removed from storage in 1959, her last words before the tape ended. They took the remaining file and said, then static. Keats replayed it 3 times, each ending the same. He looked at the map print hanging on his wall and thought of Brecht's last letter. Truth waits longer than we do. The file was closed again, but the sound of that severed sentence lingered like the echo of an engine beneath ice, rising then fading into the cold. Audio tape from Inquiry cuts off mid-sentence. The Inquiry's final report was published in 93, 300 pages of legal restraint and bureaucratic distance. The cover bore a plain title, Findings of the Project Cinder Review Committee. Beneath the crest, the dedication line read, "To those who served and to those who waited." But between its cautious paragraphs buried in appendices and cross-references, the story of Sergeant Raymond Doyle unfolded piece by piece. His name appeared 15 times, each citation followed by the same phrase, deceased non-culpable participant. The commission called his death a tragedy of circumstance. The press called it justice at last. Irene called it the smallest truth money could buy. By the time Keats visited her again that summer, she was bedridden, her hair snow-white and thin. She kept the compass on her nightstand, its needle still faintly twitching. "They've given him a medal," she said without emotion. "Posthumous recognition for unacknowledged service. They think that settles it." Keats placed the newspaper beside her pillow. The headline read, "Government apologizes to families of cinder contractors." Beneath a photograph showed a minister shaking hands with veterans' widows, eyes lowered, smiles thin. The caption made no mention of Lake Arbour. He told her the Inquiry had found no living culprits. Every official tied to the 1949 operations was either dead or untraceable. The only lingering question left deliberately unaddressed concerned the missing materials. Some records hinted that portions of the munitions had been recovered and stored off-site. Others suggested the inventory had been incomplete from the start. The report's language danced between implication and denial. Irene listened without speaking. When he finished, she said, "You know what they really buried, don't you?" Keats looked at her puzzled. "Accountability," she said. "Not bodies, not barrels, just accountability." She passed away that winter before the government ceremony that unveiled a brass plaque near Lake Arbour, in memory of those who contributed to Canada's post-war recovery efforts. It stood on a small concrete base overlooking the cove, the same place where her brother's Jeep had once surfaced. Keats attended the unveiling alone. The sky was white and windless. Reporters asked perfunctory questions about historical healing. He gave brief answers. When the cameras left, he remained at the shoreline, listening to the soft groan of the ice. He could still picture Doyle's silhouette, the Jeep idling, the map folded on the seat, headlights dissolving into fog. A month later, the archives released a final batch of records from the inquiry. Among them were photographs labeled Lake Arbour Disposal Operations, 1949. The images showed men rolling metal drums across the ice faces obscured by parkas. One close-up captured a barrel mid-descent into a hole cut through the ice. A clerk had written beneath it, "Contained ordnance rendered safe." The following week, a federal lab published a chemical analysis of soil and water samples from the site. The results confirmed trace residues of leaded fuel, nitrate compounds, and rust particulates. The report concluded that no ongoing hazard remains. Yet a quiet note at the end admitted certain components remain classified under defense statute. The public moved on. Funding for follow-up studies vanished. By the next winter, only the local museum in Regina kept any reference to the case, a single glass display titled The Doyle Inquiry. Inside sat 3 artifacts: the compass, the wrench, and the folded map. Under the light, its red pencil lines seemed almost translucent, yet the marks still shone like veins through old parchment. Children visiting the museum pressed their faces to the glass, tracing the X's with their fingertips. The curator often caught herself wondering what stories those lines held. One evening, when the last visitors had gone, she tilted the case lamp and noticed something she hadn't seen before. On the map's lower margin, beneath years of framing shadow, faint handwriting shimmered under the angled light. C9 reassignment, North Ridge sector. She reported the find, but no one followed up. The file was considered closed, the evidence archivally stable. Months later, Keats returned to the museum with a small group of documentarians. He stood before the display, his reflection merging with Doyle's red lines. The curator asked if he believed the full story had ever been told. "Enough of it to haunt the rest," he replied. That night, he visited the lake one last time. The plaque gleamed in moonlight, half buried in snow. He placed Irene's compass beside it, the glass cracked but needles still twitching north. Then he walked back toward the road, leaving a trail of prints that filled slowly with drifting powder. Back in town, the curator filed her final note to the archive board. Specimen stable map, edges unretouched, one corner darker than rest. She didn't know why that corner never faded, why the red still burned brighter there, as if something beneath the glass refused to die. One corner still dark with unfaded ink. 3 decades after the inquiry, the story of Sergeant Raymond Doyle belonged mostly to archives and classroom footnotes. Lake Arbour had become a recreation site, picnic tables, boat launches, campers on weekends. Children swam where the jeep had once been pulled from the silt, their laughter drifting across the water that had swallowed generations of silence. The plaque on the shore weathered to dull brass, its inscription almost illegible beneath streaks of lichen in memory of those who served. But the lake had not finished speaking. In the spring of 2023, a provincial environmental survey was commissioned to map subaquatic terrain for future tourism infrastructure. The team arrived with sonar and digital buoys scanning the depths in grid patterns. Most readings showed silt plains and debris, ordinary shadows. Then one return pulse appeared sharper, rectangular metallic, partly buried less than 50 meters from where Doyle's jeep had been recovered in 1959. The shape's dimensions didn't match any known civilian vehicle. The technician circled it in red on his display and noted unidentified object follow-up required. 2 weeks later, the report was filed and quietly archived under non-priority artifacts. No follow-up occurred. When Keats, now 83 and nearly blind, received a copy of the sonar data from an old colleague, he recognized the coordinates immediately. "It's the same line," he whispered. "North Cove. Camp 9 axis." The implication was simple: another vehicle, another sealed chapter still sleeping under the lake. He wrote one final article for a small online publication few would read. The title, "The Fourth X." He described the recurring pattern across Doyle's map, the line of burial stretching from the southern jeep site to the quarry and beyond. Each mark, he wrote, was not a destination, but a confession. Every X was a warning he left for us, and we mistook it for a grave. No editor cut him this time. The piece ran unaltered. Comments poured in from younger readers discovering the case for the first time. One posted a question beneath the article: "If everything was found, why does the water still glow red at sunset?" The remark lingered with him. Weeks later, a museum intern cleaning the Doyle inquiry display noticed condensation forming inside the glass case that held the map. She lifted the panel slightly to air it out, and in that brief moment, moisture from her hand darkened one of the old red pencil lines. When the light caught it, a fourth mark appeared, faint, previously invisible, drawn where the paper's fold met the margin. The intern photographed it before resealing the glass, her reflection caught in the glare. She sent the image to her supervisor, who filed it as artifact reflection anomaly. No one checked whether the mark was real pencil or only shadow. That summer, the lake's level dropped again after a dry season. From the overlook, sunlight struck the water in strange streaks, revealing something metallic beneath the ripples. Dull silver half buried the shape of a vehicle roof. Tourists assumed it was a rock. An environmental contractor who saw the anomaly reported it to the district office. The form was log-stamped and filed in a beige cabinet under routine observations. At the bottom of the sheet in pencil, someone wrote a brief note, maybe a clerk, maybe no one official at all. Object lies along same vector as Doyle coordinates. Recommend further review. No follow-up occurred. The museum still stands in Regina. Each year the map is dusted, its glass polished, its edges checked for mold. Visitors read the captions. Recovered map, item 7. Compass, item 9. Personal wrench, item 12. Few notice the faint bleed of red under the lamp. Fewer still realize that under the right angle of light, 4 X's are visible instead of 3. At night, when the staff leave the alarm, sensors blink in silent rhythm, casting thin reflections across the case. For a moment, the light catches on the glass, and the red marks seem to shimmer like embers in water. Some say it's only refraction, the distortion of light through aged pigment. Others who remember the story call it something else, a signal from beneath the lake where truth still waits for the courage to rise. And when the room grows dark, the last glow remains under the map's corner. Not reflection, not pigment, but the faint bleed of Doyle's original line, stubborn against time, pointing north toward the one secret no one has yet retrieved. Beneath the glass, one red X still bleeds.